Hello, all. I hope you're all well. Today, as the title of our show suggests, I want to talk about hateful content that is being served on almost all social media platforms. I have a confession to make. I'm not trying to consume this content, but I do spend anywhere between um, 6 to 7 hours. I'm being conservative here. That's a bit of a lie. It's more like 8 hours a day on my phone, and most of it is on these social media apps. And a lot of the content, especially on platforms like Twitter, Facebook, and even TikTok and Instagram, is, for the lack of a better word, hateful. It's exclusionary. It targets a group of people. It could be Islamophobic. It could be anti-Semitic. It could be a lot of things. And most of the times, it's targeting minority groups. And at times, it is also being directed by minorities against minorities. To get an idea of all of this, I'm joined from the United States by Elad Nahuri, who is basically he's a writer on anti-Semitism and extremism and hateful content online. So Elad, let's get straight to it. What do we mean when we say hate Inc. when it comes to these social media platforms?
Yeah, I mean, really what we're talking about is a method of bringing together and amplifying and mainstreaming hatred, extremism, and in this case, I guess would be anti-Semitism, because what we're really seeing is that, we know that 10, 20 years ago, a lot of the bigotry that we're seeing today would not be as main or wasn't as mainstream as it is now. And a lot of that has to do with the fact there's a difference between kind of a latent bigotry that exists in our society as a whole and kind of the extremist hatred that calls for more literally extreme consequences to simply being, a different person or for being Jewish and that kind of thing. So Elon Musk taking over Twitter is a really good example of this. What happened was Twitter, before it was taken over, was a not very good platform in terms of protecting people from hatred and bigotry, but it was still being run by a company that cared, in some sense at least, of being perceived as fighting bigotry. Now you have a person who is controlling a platform of 330 million people and is actually using it specifically to spread bigotry. So, for example, making the word cis into a slur while allowing, for example, there are openly anti-Semitic posts that are out there now that people, I know there's one in particular went viral recently that was reported a lot, still up. There's a lot of that while anti-fascist journalists are being suspended. So this kind of stuff is essentially taking the sort of extremism and bigotry that we're used to from, like, quote unquote, the dark corners of the internet, like 4chan and 8chan and that kind of thing, and saying we're going to put this on a mainstream platform. And what that does is it allows these people who were once on the fringes to suddenly have a mainstream audience and be mainstreamed. And we're seeing the consequences of that in just 1 year. So, it's one example. Unfortunately, there's many others. The truth is that even without Elon Musk's contribution, these extremists have really found really effective ways to game social media platforms, to game search engines and that kind of thing, to really YouTube. They've really found effective ways to essentially game algorithms in order to make themselves seem more mainstream than they are, which becomes kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy.
You speak of anti-Semitism. There's also Islamophobia,
Right.
and you mentioned Elon Musk. Him liking certain tweets or commenting under those tweets which are Islamophobic or anti-Semitic gives it a viral nature, or makes it go viral essentially. Talk
Right.
about, well, do you think that the this hate is stemming from the same source, so to speak, or
Yeah,
anti-Semitism, Islamophobia?
absolutely. I mean, I think it's actually really fascinating because one of the things that I try and bring attention to is that these, on the one hand, these bigotries, first of all, they amplify each other, because what happens is you have a group that has various forms of bigotry, and what they can do is essentially it's almost like a marketing technique. They silo one form of hate in terms of the way they market it. First they go after Muslims, then they'll do like an anti-Semitic post, and they'll kind of like, essentially what they're doing is grabbing different people who have different forms of bigotry. So someone who might be transphobic but not anti-Semitic suddenly will become more anti-Semitic because they're getting because they first were attracted by the transphobia, right? So the same thing goes with Islamophobia. Islamophobia, as we know, has been quite overt and quite extreme for a while in America. This is not like anything new. And that becomes, in its own way, a way to suck people into other forms of bigotry, because it's basically, like in particular now, for example, transphobia is a good example of this, but Islamophobia is for sure still extremely big part of this. I would call it a marketing campaign, where you essentially take the group that is the most vulnerable and the most widely vilified and most overtly vilified, and use them as like kind of an engine to eventually draw people towards hating groups that are more protected or more privileged in some sense, yet still a target of extremists. So essentially what we're talking about is like ultimately the groups that we're seeing, the extremist groups, what they're trying to do is they're not usually against one group. What they're trying to say is, we want to have a Christian, a male. Essentially, they're saying we want male Christians with money to have male. Sorry, it's so many. It's a long list. So white male Christians with resources to be the rulers of America. And what that means is, by definition, every single person that doesn't fall under that is targeted. It's just a question of in what order and how many people do you kind of fool to join you along the way, who are eventually going to also be sacrificed. So women are a perfect example of this. Eventually, the goal is to subjugate them. It's already happened now. We're seeing with the abortion issue, but it's going to get worse and worse as time passes. So Muslims, in that sense, are a prominent group to be focused on, because the vilification of Muslims happened well before social media proliferated. It was something that became mainstream for a while, especially after 2001 and 9/11. Yeah, so we're seeing that essentially being fostered. And what that does is, as you create more hate for other groups through that method, you're then creating an even more extreme echo chamber that's then more willing to cause violence or to target Muslims as well. So it becomes this kind of self-feeding mechanism, where the more groups you cause bigotry against, the more the actual hatred itself also becomes amplified. So we're now seeing, a rise in hate crime, a rise in hate violence. We're seeing obviously a huge rise in mass shootings targeting vulnerable groups. So it's not just the broadness of the hate, it's also the fact that it's becoming more extreme and more acted upon as well.
It's almost like, it sounds like a cascading effect, almost like a gateway drug. If you have bigotry against, as you said, one group or a group of people, and then it just cascades into bigotry from the same source for other minority groups or groups that are historically targeted. You're Jewish, you're in the US, we're talking about hatred online, or the hate ink that is developed or has developed online. How do you see that reflect, or how does that reflect what's happening in real life, in everyday life? Have you noticed anything personally, or?
I mean, sure. I mean, I think, it's interesting because I lived in New York for a while, and then we moved to Long Beach, which is near Orange County in California. And, it's a pretty white area. It has some conservative pockets and that kind of thing. And, it's hard to quantify. It's not something where I can, at least on a personal level, where.
Well, tell us your story.
Yeah.
Tell us about your story. You said you grew up,
Sure.
where'd you grow up? How did you become involved in talking about this?
Oh boy, that's a long story, but yeah, I can, I'll share. Like, I think I actually, what's my story is actually connected to my own, what I consider to be my own extremism, because I was I was a brown Jewish kid growing up in a suburb that was Jewish but very white, and I think I felt very alone for a long time, and I was kind of looking for meaning, looking for a group to connect to. And when I got to college, towards the end, I ended up connecting with this group. It's pretty well known in the Jewish world, called Chabad. It's a Hasidic group. And they essentially have missionaries that come to colleges. It's framed as like a synagogue and that kind of thing, but it's essentially missionary work. I joined that group pretty quickly, ended up moving to Israel for a while, ended up becoming more right wing as I joined them, which is kind of a natural progression of that group as well. And got married very quickly. And as I became more embedded in that group, and I eventually moved into Hasidic Community. At first, I was very, typical, like extremist, very passionate, very kind of very intense about it. But as time passed and I was a writer in the community, I started to notice a lot of systemic issues around abuse, and that kind of thing. And I became more vocal about that, became outspoken. And the more that I saw the reaction, the more I saw the extremism problems. Eventually, very, very long story short, I ended up leaving the community. And the truth is that
I'm guessing not on good terms.
no, not on good terms. No, unfortunately, I moved. That was the move to Long Beach was because of that. Actually, was leaving behind that world, and trying to kind
So
of create a new one.
not just leaving behind a community, you left a city,
Yeah, yeah. I mean,
basically.
it was multiple steps exactly, because at first I just left the community. I stayed modern Orthodox, but was still very connected to the Hasidic community. But then at a certain point, for my wife and I, because we became very vocal activists in our community, and the backlash was very, very intense. Anyone
Activists
who's
for or against what?
um, that was also a
Because I think for
progression.
the
I think,
benefit of our
yeah,
viewers, just to
sure,
contextualize it, the
sure,
Hasidic community, as you mentioned, is a very close-knit community. It's very inward-looking. From pop culture now, in the past few years, we find out that they don't want to interact with people outside necessarily. In Israel, the Hasidic community has many layers to it as well, some of which are extreme and then feed into what some call this a judicial coup. I don't know if Itamar Ben Gavir would would qualify as a part of the community, but there are layers and it's extremely complex.
yeah. It's complex. It's interesting because the community I was part of is technically usually seen as less extreme because they kind of have a philosophy of not cutting the outside world out. But the reason for that, what people don't really get about that, is that the reason for that essentially comes down to the fact that they are very committed to missionary work, where they're trying to bring in non-Orthodox Jews and make them Hasidic, and Chabad in particular.
It's
So
interesting you mentioned that
uh,
because you can't convert into Judaism, can you? So when you
you
talk
can
about
you
a
can
Jewish missionary,
yeah.
it's within the Jewry that they're trying to.
Right. You can convert, but it's more of a process, and they're definitely not trying to convert non-Jews for sure. It's like and that's also part of the confusion, because most people, if I even to Jewish people, if I describe this as missionary work, they tend to first be confused or really disagree, because as far as they're aware, it's really just about other religions. But honestly, anyone who's trying to change your entire life through changing your perception of reality to join an entirely different community is in some sense a missionary, right? So yeah, when I joined that community, I think I also kind of considered it very open-minded, because they were very welcoming and very open when I first joined. And that's essentially, if you learn anything about missionary work, that's how it starts. You start off love bombed, as they call it, like very, very accepted. It's very, very ecstatic, very exciting. It's really interesting because part of why I brought this up is because now when I see the way people recruit online with extremism, or recruit in person, and with extremist communities, it's very, very in line. It's like a pattern of behavior and a pattern of building a society and a community that's built around trying to recruit people. And so that's essentially what happens. But then at a certain point, that switches, right? At a certain point, you're no longer the one who's being sold to. You're no longer the one who's about to buy the product. You've bought the product, you live in it, you've turned your entire life over for it. So if you've done that, it's going to be extremely hard to leave at some point. And at that point, that's when things start to switch, both communally, leaders as well. They'll suddenly be much more invested in kind of making you fall into line, as opposed to like the original style. And So when I first became quote unquote activist, I didn't even kind of mean to be. It was just that I was seeing a lot of abuse problems. I started speaking out about it, writing about it. Um, and I quickly understood that just speaking about these things made me into an activist, meaning your job when you're in such a community is to not make problems public. It's not to talk about problems, it's to stay silent. And so if you have an audience in particular and you have people who are interested in what you have to say and you make these problems public, even if people are willing to admit they are a problem, which in and of itself is like a first step, but let's say they get that far, the first reaction after that is you should not be making this public, and they'll say it very overtly to you. It's and we hear this a lot. You've heard it from different communities, depending on which community you're part of. Like they will say things like "don't air dirty laundry," that kind of thing. And I think what's interesting in the Jewish world is that you kind of add a layer of historical trauma where we know that the outside world is looking at us and examining us and is looking for excuses to hurt us. That's a big part of this narrative. And so, when you talk about these things, it's very often you can feel that that's kind of a big part of it. And so the reaction to it can be really intense. And as I spoke about that more, I started to see other problems. Then around 2016, you can probably guess what happened, but Trump started to rise, and I was really shocked because at that time had definitely become very conservative in a lot of ways, but I'd always felt that the community itself was going to grow and become more accepting of Muslims, become more accepting of immigrants, and all these things, and gay people, and it was, oh yeah, in particular sexual abuse, because I'd been so outspoken about it. But I think we started to see the way people were talking about Muslims in my community, the way that they were talking about Black people, and not just my community. This was like a widespread problem among ultra Orthodox Jews. And
And
then
it's not just
hearing,
about within the Jewish community. It's also Muslims also talk about
right,
Jews in these anti-Semitic, tropish terms, Jews controlling the world. And, there's a historical conflict, Al-Aqsa in Jerusalem, and
right,
the Israeli occupation. So it kind of, I guess it leads to the question, you've got a dominant hate or hate Inc. online, and then you've got minority hatred that
mm,
fuels or goes against each other as opposed to working together in some sort of alliance against hatred.
right, absolutely. I mean, and I think what's interesting about that is, with the Trump issue, what became clear to me was that this was no longer just this latent bigotry, which I had seen for a while, but this became like overt and proud almost, and spreading further, which I didn't see coming. I'd always thought this was going to be a moderating influence over time, like just them being more public, them being more outgoing as a community would also make them more moderate. And I think we've seen this in a lot of communities, that are conservative, that have attached to Trump. We tend to see them start to become, I'm referring to minority communities, that you would not have expected them to kind of accept this in this way, but became very widespread. So it's really interesting to me and really sad. And then after the Hollywood Access tape, I was really shocked because people who were literal abuse advocates in my community were actually justifying it in the same language that they used to get very angry at others for justifying abuse in the Jewish world. That that he just was just talking or whatever. It's just, or when they believed it to be true, they didn't think they would point at Hillary and all that. It's all the stuff
And
we're all
Trump
used
doesn't
to.
hide, it's not that Trump hides his bigotry in any
Right?
way.
Yeah.
He
Exactly.
conflates Jews with Israel and, them. Then you have the Muslim ban that came in. So he's quite
Right.
honest about his bigotry. And maybe that's part of the appeal.
Exactly. I mean, I think that's exactly what the appeal was. The appeal was, now you have someone who's not afraid, quote unquote, to be to say all these things that people feel without any apology. And I think that there was an attraction to that. And I think that, especially when you already have a latent bigotry or an overt bigotry that you're kind of hiding, suddenly this is kind of freeing and gives a lot of justification to it, and it also allows the kind of extremist narrative that you've built around different issues to become more justified. If you are concerned about your community being, hurt by assimilation and all these things, then diversity becomes an enemy in a lot of ways. And then when you have someone saying, like, not only is diversity an enemy, like, these people are subhuman and you should be extremely, extremely concerned about them. Even if Jews, for example, were refugees and are only here, many of them are only here because they were accepted by America. Now, for them to suddenly be suspicious of refugees, you would think is hypocritical, but the truth is it kind of feeds that extremist narrative. And unfortunately, the more you have someone justifying it and who's in a leadership position, especially if you're so concerned about your enemy, it feeds on itself and gets worse.
You're
So that
mentioning
was,
we mentioned Trump, and I think it's important to mention that he was banned from Twitter, but that didn't necessarily dampen his popularity. In fact, he grew. Some would argue he grew even more popular after being banned from Twitter while he was the president and on his way out. So I guess it's a catch-22. Once you unleash, or the genie's out of the box, there's no way it can be put back in.
yeah, it's tough. I mean, I think what's interesting about this stuff, and I think it's also a big reason moderates are afraid to push, is that when you have consequences for an extremist leader like Trump, it actually feeds the narrative, because there's this kind of dual narrative to extremism, which is we're both like massive victims. We are the victims of the era, and on the other hand, we are the heroes of the story. So like, there's this interesting thing where you're both like completely helpless, completely controlled by outside force, deep state, and all these things. And on the other hand, you are this like powerful, strong hero that's gonna like save humanity. And so having these dual things is really interesting. When anything happens, when you succeed, it becomes a justification for your narrative. And when consequences occur, it really feeds a sense of victimhood, which allows you to further justify it becomes, as we've seen in many different examples, it becomes a way to justify an extreme response. So all of a sudden, a coup against the United States, led by a former president, is seen as justified because everyone was convinced for years that he was a victim of these larger forces, right? So victimhood is incredibly powerful. I think that's something I saw in my community as well, like how the historical trauma justified a lot of really kind of abhorrent views and behaviors and that kind of thing. But in the big picture, the consequences are still extremely important. And when they don't occur, it's much worse than if there aren't consequences. We just have to admit this is going to be a tough ride either way.
So finally, I think we've painted such a bleak picture for our audience.
So what happens when you talk to me?
Well, join the club, I guess. But is there room for optimism? Is there room for alliance building? And especially if the real world problems, for example, Jews are the enemies of Muslims, or Muslims want to eradicate all Jews. These kind of narratives, they exist in the world, and they become a source of both Islamophobia and anti-Semitism. Is there room for minorities to coalesce, come together, form alliances to fight hatred, get over that, or build a new narrative maybe?
I mean, I think the interesting, like, for lack of a better word, I'll say beautiful thing I've learned since starting this kind of work is that all this bleak stuff it's only bleak when you're only looking at the extremists, right? If you're only defining the way you look at the world through extremism, which I think happens to a lot of anti-extremists, is then it's very depressing and it can be paralyzing and scary and all these things. But the thing is, all of that is actually a roadmap to what you're describing, which is what does that actually mean about the world you want? Because everything that makes it feel bleak is an indication of the world you actually want and the world you can build, right? So for example, the way you're describing it right now of an alliance between communities, I think that's exactly right. I think what's really interesting about the way, I was pointing out how this marketing succeeds is because what it does is it takes each group, focuses on them individually so that you will slowly get more and more integrated into a larger hate against multiple groups. So what that means is the answer to that is that you have to build alliances between communities and also spread the word about how we are all interconnected. Because if you don't do that, if that narrative doesn't spread, then you're vulnerable, because then people will willingly accept that we're just going after one group and this is not about larger hatred, right? Which is, it's sad that people are okay with that, but we can also say, like, the way to immunize people is to kind of, rather than have them focus on one group at a time, start to build a narrative of every single person and every single vulnerable group in particular deserves to be seen as human, and if you want to be spiritual, divine. And for that reason, number one, we need to connect more. Number two, we need to work more together. And number three, we need to start making sure that our specific communities come along for that ride, right? So, like, all of that points to, in my opinion, a much more beautiful world than the world we had before that, which was very siloed, very, bigotry against one group was more accepted on a wide level, especially Black people in the United States. And we're starting to learn, I think, and I hope that this becomes a much more widespread narrative, that we're really not going to get out of this unless we all have a larger vision of the future that is about every human being uplifted.
And changing mindsets, changing or
right,
self-correcting, or
exactly.
self-reflecting. I think self-reflection is an important part here. And I think what you have said, maybe this can start a conversation. The conversation between us is part
Yeah.
of a larger conversation as well, as to how we move forward. But I'll give you the last word. But thank you so much for bringing all of these different divergent ideas and hates and trying to contextualize it.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. And like you said, I mean, this is the example of it, is us talking, us chatting, building alliances, connecting with each other. I'm very honored to be on here, and thank you so much for having me.
So as Ilad was saying, none of this hate online or this hate incorporated is in a vacuum. It's all interconnected, and it increases or it spreads because there is a lack of alliances between groups that are being targeted, be it African Americans, be it Jews, be it Muslims in North America, in Europe, and elsewhere. Do subscribe and keep sending your comments and suggestions on Twitter at Ali_Mustafa and on YouTube on this channel. Take care.